It was the spring of 1943, and a room in Tokyo that had never expected to be surprised sat heavy with the smell of stale tobacco and ink and the soft electrical hum of teleprinters. In that room, an impossible conclusion was forming as messages that should have been secret arrived already anticipated on foreign battle maps. Every convoy route and every tactical note that Japan believed private had been turning up with surgical precision in American hands. The consequence was immediate and brutal. Ships that should have sailed safely did not. Patrols walked into prepared kill zones, and the momentum of entire campaigns slipped through fingers that had trusted a code to keep them invisible. What they said in closed doors that week would reveal not just a technical failure, but a fracture in judgment that cost lives. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been the towering strategist behind many operations, yet in private he was tired and terse and held a cigarette with a habit of tapping ash into a chipped porcelain tray. How did a nation that prided itself on secrecy learn, in whispers and shuffles of paper, that its messages read like a newspaper to the enemy? 3 scenes of discovery, 3 secret conversations, 1 admission that would echo across Pacific Command. Dawn the next morning brought the first stark example. A patrol boat radioed in a routine sighting, and within hours the coordinates were referenced in a raid report that arrived from across the ocean. The scene at sea smelled of diesel and salt. Flags snapped against masts. Men squinted into a sky that kept its secrets. At 0600, the convoy signal was logged in Tokyo. And at 0615, a coastal gun battery received orders that matched the convoy profile to the letter. Sailors on the lead freighter, who had joked over canned coffee minutes before, later described the sound of metal tearing and a wet shudder through the hull. In command, the official log read like a microscope slide of failure. The timing matched, the angles were pre-planned, and the response left no room for chance. Captain Saito, on watch that morning, radioed the bridge with a voice that later was quoted in an internal memorandum as flat with disbelief. "We saw them lined up as if waiting for a curtain to lift." A duty officer, Lieutenant Hoshino, smelled the diesel and felt the grit of wind on his teeth as he reported. A telegram from the naval attach at the embassy in Honolulu arrived that evening with a single line underlined in red: "Patterns too perfect to be random." The first short exchange between field and headquarters was quick and ordinary, yet it carried a weight that would force actors into rooms they had avoided. "Report the damage." "We did." "Where did they get our routes?" "Unknown." "Check radio logs." "All clear." "Keep watch." "Yes, sir." The first man to spot a pattern at an operational level was Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Tanaka, a signals officer,
whose job had always been to trust patterns and catch anomalies. He had an eye for repetition, the way a musician hears an off note, and he kept a small leather notebook in which he wrote times not for ceremony, but to measure rhythm. He traced 3 months of convoy directions and found that losses and delays had a curious regularity in timing and bearing that could not be explained by coincidence. He filed a short classified report and passed it to his immediate superior, only to be met with a shrug that smelled like bureaucracy and a defensive joke meant to ease tension. "Parity of routes," the superior said, and stamped the paper with an office mark. In a corridor later, Tanaka felt the varnish of the handrail under his palm and heard distant footsteps as if the building itself was listening. He wrote again. He estimated probabilities and used simple combinatorics to show that repeated interceptions at the same temporal offsets had odds of less than 1 in 5,000. His report sat for days on a stack of other documents about fuel allocations and shore leave. Outside perspective arrived like a cold wind. A coded cable from an Allied station contained a fragment that did not belong to diplomatic chatter, but to operational intercepts. The cable referenced a translated phrase and attached a frequency analysis. In a locked room, a lieutenant from an Allied mission had drawn up a matrix and circled anomalies in pencil. A meeting was called in the War Ministry, and the room filled with men who carried identity through posture more than speech. Admiral Nomura opened the folder, and the paper crackled in the hush. The exchanges in that room were sharp, measured, and in public terms routine, yet beneath each line lay disbelief. They claimed to have correlated our patrol net with their flight schedules. It cannot be. Here are the timestamps. Impossible to be systematic. Verify the ciphers again. We will. The proof from the Allies arrived with numbers that read like a verdict. A civilian liaison named Commander Ito produced supporting logs, and a junior cryptographer named Lieutenant Nakamura presented a chart of repeating sequences. The smell of ink and lemon oil from polished tables mingled with cheap tea. For every skeptic, there was an officer who quietly rubbed his jaw and tasted iron in his mouth. The first public acknowledgement in that room was a denial wrapped in procedural words, but internally a note of panic began to grow. Evidence amassed not as rumor, but as mathematics. Dr. Kenji Kuroda, the Navy cryptanalyst assigned to signals intelligence, ran a statistical test that removed romance from the argument. He took intercepted messages and ran frequency counts on 3 key sequences, and then randomized the order to simulate chance. He calculated the p-value and presented results in a slide that had a jagged edge of certainty. The probability that the series of successful enemy anticipations had occurred by accident sat at a fraction of a percent. A table of successes per engagement looked nothing like Gaussian noise and everything like guided prediction. If these results are valid, Kuroda told the intelligence officer Major Fujita in a voice low enough to keep others from hearing, then our codes are compromised. Fujita tasted burnt tea and adjusted his spectacles and said what many were thinking aloud but fewer would write. Then who has the access? Kuroda named the likely capabilities the Americans would need to intercept and decode. Captured keys, captured machine parts, and hours of intercepted traffic. He outlined the logistical improbability, yet did not soften the blow. Charts, percentages, and a cautious probabilistic narrative left less room for comforting myths. Pride and institutional inertia complicated the response. Senior officers argued that to change ciphers in wartime would require a logistical feat, and acknowledged that a wholesale switch could reveal their concern. General Sugiyama spoke of chain of custody and the risk of sowing panic among field commanders. To replace systems now is to admit vulnerability, he said, and the room felt colder, as if a window had been opened. Admiral Yamamoto sipped coffee and flicked ash without looking up, and argued from experience about the chaos that rapid change could unleash. Colonel Matsuda raised the political risk of admitting breach before the cabinet, fearing morale collapse. Admirals Ozawa and Nomura debated trade-offs, and the language of their debate was polite yet edged in something like self-preservation. In corridors, staff whispered of the Emperor and of how a public admission might be interpreted as weakness. The arguments had logic. Replacing codebooks across a theater in wartime required secure couriers, fresh training, and a timeline that commanders feared could expose movements during the swap. The rhetoric of practicality masked another force: institutional shame. Officers who had built careers on competence found the idea of their systems being penetrated intolerable. A second scene of tension unfolded in a small office lit by a single lamp, where Tanaka confronted his chain of command and asked for action. He had prepared a packet of timestamps and raw intercepts, and when he pushed it across the table, he felt the grain of the wood through the papers. "These are the incidents," he said, and his voice held a nervous edge. "You are saying they are too neat to be coincidence." "We are saying check again," his superior replied, and the room smelled of cheap cigarettes. Tanaka pushed back, and the exchange escalated into a set of 6 careful, sharp retorts, in which each man revealed the limits of his authority.
"If you will not move, then I must escalate," Tanaka said. "Escalate to whom?" asked the superior. "To the Office of Cryptanalysis," Tanaka answered. "They will tell you," the superior said, and folded his hands. "If this is true, we cannot trust our orders," Tanaka said. "Then our operations will grind to a halt," the superior said. The moment held like
A held breath, and the desk lamp cast long shadows that felt like other listeners. That tension made personal histories leak into policy. Tanaka remembered a childhood in a port town, the taste of fish and the creak of rope as his father sailed away, and now he felt those noises as memory and threat. The battlefield confirmed the analysis with a sequence of losses that no longer seemed isolated. A planned offensive in the southwest found beaches empty of defenders, only in order to be funneled into kill zones prepared inland. Reports from the field mentioned flares that seemed to be timed with the movement of assault units and artillery that waited with terrible patience. Sergeant Wada, a radial operator at a forward battery, reported the metallic taste of fear and the copper tang in his mouth as artillery found their coordinates before the assault had formed. Convoys sent to reinforce a besieged port were sunk in straits that had been declared safe on charts just the day before. Casualty lists grew, and with them a quiet around dining tables in prefectures far from the front. Comparisons between damage inflicted and expected losses returned numbers that made officers draw breath and stare at maps as if at betrayal. "We learned too late that what we sent felt rehearsed to the enemy," an operations note read, and in the margins someone had scribbled a name. In the weeks that followed, closed meetings multiplied, and the tone shifted from defensive to resigned to urgent. A particular session convened at night in a room with frosted windows and an air of conspiracy. Present were Admiral Yamamoto, General Sugiyama, Admiral Nomura, Colonel Matsuda, Captain Saito, Lieutenant Nakamura, Major Fujita, Commander Ito, and Dr. Kuroda. The dialogue in that meeting was long and heavy, with exchanges that moved from accusation to calculation to bargaining. "How long have they been reading us?" Yamamoto asked. "We cannot say exactly," Kuroda replied. "Then how many operations are compromised?" Sugiyama pressed. "At least a dozen with high probability," Kuroda answered. "Can we change now?" Nomura asked. "We can attempt, but there will be gaps," Nakamura said. "Gaps that they will exploit instantly," Saito countered. "If we delay, we lose more men," Ito said. "If we act, we reveal panic," Matsuda murmured. "We must weigh lives against secrecy," Fujita said. "We must weigh command against survival," Yamamoto said. The room felt the gravity of a decision that would not be made by one man alone. The exchange ran to 8 moves, and ended not with resolution, but with an agreed compromise to alter some procedures while keeping core ciphers the same. The choice was practical and political, and it was fatal in small increments. A final moment of tension and confession arrived months later, when losses had accumulated and the pattern could no longer be explained away. The Prime Minister demanded answers, and a small inner circle prepared a transcript that would later be cited in inquiries. In a private hearing, Admiral Yamamoto folded a paper and admitted to the Prime Minister that he believed the enemy had broken their communications. His words were not theatrical, but precise and edged with personal regret. "I thought we could absorb shocks," he said. "I thought our codes were secure." The Prime Minister asked whether a full code change had been attempted. Yamamoto said no, and explained the logistical fear and the political cost. He described in halting sentences the smell of the sea, the creak of ships, and the ash of his cigarettes, and admitted that pride had delayed action. The confession was a rupture. It was the first internal admittance that the chain of command had chosen reputation over a rapid technical fix.
In the official minutes, a line reads that the change would have required secure distribution of new keys to dozens of ships and hundreds of field units within weeks, a task they judged impossible without exposing movements. The minutes also record a casualty count and a change in theater control within 3 months. Consequences unfolded in 3 measured time frames: 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the initial discovery. After 1 month, small procedural changes reduced some exposures, but did not stop sophisticated interceptions that relied on patterns rather than single keys. After 3 months, the High Command authorized limited codebook replacements for select convoys and shifted routes, but the effort was partial and slow, and the enemy adapted. After 6 months, a wider rekeying had occurred, but only after significant loss of material and morale. Territories once held with confidence slipped into contested zones, and the public narrative became one of strategic miscalculation. Internationally, the enemy gained leverage, and domestically, the admission unsettled a population taught to trust command. The epilogue was a public statement that acknowledged a compromise in communications and promised reforms, while failing to capture the private sense of betrayal felt by many officers. In the end, the record showed a mix of technical failure and human decision. The statistical evidence suggested that the chance of repeated successful anticipations being random was negligible, and that correlation with enemy capabilities painted a clear picture. Yet even with proof in hand, institutional culture and the logistics of wartime made immediate overhaul politically costly and operationally complicated. The lesson recorded in archives was blunt. To deny mathematical evidence for reasons of pride invites a cost measured in lives and territory. If you felt the same chill of indignation reading about perfect ambushes and ignored warnings, write below and start your comment with pride or with failure to help the discussion focus. Tell us whether you think commanders were simply incompetent or whether structural issues made a different choice impossible. Comments shape future episodes, and your perspective helps historians frame debates. Now return with us as we open the classified folders, read the marginal notes, and listen to the private confessions that were rarely meant for public ears. If this episode moved you, subscribe for
the next installment, where we will publish excerpts from the original logs and show the charts that convinced a nation to change or to delay. At the close of this investigation, the historical record kept its harsh clarity. Reports annotated by Lieutenant Nakamura and Major Fujita were archived. Dr. Kuroda retired with the weight of numbers he could not ignore. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka continued to file reports and to listen for patterns until the end of the war. Admirals Nomura and Yamamoto left different legacies, yet both carried in private the knowledge that a code had been penetrated. The final public admission came months later in a brief communiqué that acknowledged a compromise and promised measures of remedy. The rhetorical closure was neat, but the practical outcome was messy and human. In 3 moments, a problem became visible to the whole command, and in each moment a human choice shaped the cost. If there is a single takeaway, it is this: admitting error early, even when it is painful, can save more lives than clinging to an image of infallibility. If you want to dive deeper, subscribe to our channel, read the source documents linked in the description, and join the conversation about how technical evidence and human judgment met on the battlefield, and why that meeting still matters today.